I have a message I would like to read. The address on the top is Heathway, Sutton Coldfield, Birmingham. To the Manchester Group. I have no words to express my gratitude to the Manchester Group. 30 years ago, I was a regular attender. I was such a regular attender that they thought I was a member. Every member in the provinces owes a great deal to Alan B., who founded the Manchester Group. Alan often told us how he sat in the Friends Meeting House with his copy of the big book, hoping that some alcoholic would join him. He was the first member in the provinces, and in his day, the only place north of Golders Green was Manchester. We all owe a tremendous lot to Alan. By the time I came along, the group was about 30 strong. Tom G. started a second group in the Holdsworth Hall, and I enjoyed sharing the life experience of so many stalwart members, such as Matthew, the three Jimmies, Jack Watson, Bernard Kelly of Blackpool, and many, many more that would be tiresome for me to recall their names. I would fain be with you all to celebrate this glorious anniversary, but Anno Domini forbids it. I hope that you all have a successful and wonderful gathering. God bless you all. Tom T. I'm an alcoholic and my name is Travers. Hi to you all. I would like to start by bringing my own personal greetings and gratitude to Alcoholics Anonymous as it shows itself and is represented in this room tonight, and in recent weeks, rooms like this all over the world. I consider Alcoholics Anonymous, without any question, to be the greatest miracle that has ever happened in the 20th century. Secondly, I would like to bring greetings to the Manchester Group from, and please note the way I said, that group to which I belong, the Newcomers Group in Bristol. I'm not going to deal with too much of that period before I came into touch with AA. Sufficient to say that I am an alcoholic and I drank for over 20 years. I was never in treatment as we know it today, but I was in 32 different mental hospitals. I was no stranger to the locked wards. I found Alcoholics Anonymous, or rather Alcoholics Anonymous came to me nearly 30 years ago, but I did not stop drinking. It was beautifully presented. by a wonderful man who performed on me a classic 12th step call. I did not ask for him. It was my mother who found him, and she had a hell of a job to find an AA member, and she sent him to call on me. To say the least, I was unreceptive. He took me to 3 meetings. I continued to drink, and I drifted away. 3 years later, one morning, and I could talk about that morning perhaps for a full hour tonight, came my day. That day in which I was not going to take alcohol or other drugs. At the end of that day, I was admitted back onto a locked ward of a mental hospital, and I remained on that locked ward for 10.5 months. Since my entry into that hospital, I have not taken drink, alcohol, and I have not taken drugs. It's sufficient to say that that was in the spring 27 years ago. Now, a little more personal identification. I'm no stranger to Manchester. I do not know it well, but I am no stranger here. I have many times been a public disgrace in Manchester. I have been in halls slightly larger than this, where many hundreds of people, and possibly up to 1,500, have seen me trying to perform as a drunken person. I find coming back to Manchester, you've let 1 or 2 things slip. What the hell has ever happened to the UCP? They're all telling each other what's happened to it. Or they're telling them each other what the UCP stands for. What on earth has happened to Yates's Wine Lodge? I am no stranger to the area. I was here earning big money before I ever really got into my drinking. And the Manchester area, the greater Manchester area, including Bolton, saw me in some of the latter stages. I will always be grateful to a newly arrived immigrant Asian family who in 1955-56, when I was sleeping out in a derelict lorry at a place called Darcy Lever in Bolton, and it was a very cold winter, and they used to bring me up food and feed me. I have always remembered that Asian family. First of all, the father seeing me stirring in the derelict cab of that lorry, and coming up with his wife with little bits of food day by day. Another lovely experience came to me this morning of Manchester. I was home on leave in 1941, and I engaged myself in my favorite pastime during my leave. I came to what was, I believe, the final Manchester November Handicap. You had a racecourse in those days. What the hell happened to that? And I always remember that afternoon's racing. I was drinking quite a bit. I always remember it because I can tell you now what the winner of the Manchester November Handicap was in 1941 at Castle Oval. It was Crown Colony, owned by Lord Glenealy, ridden by Dick Perriman, trained by Joe Lawson. I do my homework, and I never forget it if I can. But I remember it was one of those very damp, dank, foggy afternoons at Castle Oval. the fog gradually coming down. Couldn't see the horses running for the first part of the race. They used to come at us like ghosts out of the gloom. Then I had to get a train to get out to Manchester. Now, I did a very alcoholic thing, and it never occurred to me that it was alcoholic until I was standing in Piccadilly this morning showing Pat the sights, or what used to be the sights. I got a taxi to get me to the station, and the fog came down and down and down and got worse and worse and worse. And eventually I got out of the taxi and told him to follow me, and I would show him the way to the station. A lot of tributes have been paid up here tonight. Some of them names that are household words to you. Tom G. especially. I knew him well. Jim here has been talking about my sponsor for 19 years, and that was Sackville of Dublin. And I wonder if Jim would know what Sackville was doing in Liverpool at that time, because I can tell him. Sackville was across in Liverpool, and he was refereeing an international match. And that's how a lot of AA got around in England in the early days, was because Sackville was an international referee. And wherever it was Cardiff, if it was Edinburgh or London, Sackville used to write to the AA members in that area and say, I shall be refereeing a match on such and such a Saturday. I would like to hear from you all and what meetings I can attend. Alan B. has been mentioned. There's another person I would like to mention who came slightly after those people, but I remember him being very active in the Manchester area, and that's Jimmy of Sale. And just two other people I would like to pay a very special tribute to, one of whom has both been mentioned tonight. One is Idle John, and it was here in Manchester that Idle John worked so hard to bring our General Service Conference into being. And it was a very, very difficult time for him. And Morris and I were two of the fortunate people who were around at the time, and I have always been inspired by one single member from Idle. The other person to whom Morris mentioned, who was a constant visitor to Manchester, was a man called Jack Howard. And he was a traveler, and he was one of those. And if you read the big book, you will see the AA message was carried initially in the first place in America and in other countries by traveling salesmen. Traveling salesmen were the greatest carriers of our message we have ever had in the early days. Jack Howard, to me, will always be one of the early greats in this country. I think he must have had it very hard. I know he did. But he got the program. And he was absolutely fearless in how he gave it on. And when he'd held forth for a little while, he would sit down quietly and say, it's not for nothing they call me Gentle Jack. Well, we could all go on recalling these names, and perhaps to some of the newer members in this room, we should say, perhaps when the next 50 years is up, the first century of Alcoholics Anonymous is here, perhaps you too will be like some of the old-timers, or early comers, I prefer, recalling, recounting names. So please bear with us tonight. This is what I suppose you would call an old-timers panel. The four of us up here, some people might think we're a fire hazard. Maybe there are some people out there who haven't been in Alcoholics Anonymous very long. Maybe deep down underneath, there is already a feeling working, saying, I would love to be an old-timer. Well, if you want to be an old-timer, I'll give you the recipe. Don't drink and don't die. We have to be very careful as recovering alcoholics not to dwell too much on congratulating each other, patting each other on the back. We have to use this time of celebration to do something positive. And so, let's put aside for the moment the 24-hour program just for today, and let's take a look at the next 50 years, 50 years at a time, because that seems now to be the time span we are dealing in. What could be our undoing? Are there some things that could happen that could cause this fellowship not to grow, but fall apart at the seams and fade away? Simple, insidious little things that we would do well to look at now. Because what happens in the next 50 years is very much dependent upon the people in this hall tonight and people like you throughout the world. So let's consider what is going to happen in the next 50 years. And I will tell you. I'm going to tell you by putting it in one of Travers's parables. Many years ago, there was a little town out in the Middle West in America, small population, hard-working, happy people. And in that town, everyone who had a problem or any real trouble in their lives used to take it to a little old man who lived outside the town in a little house up on a hill. Any dispute, any argument between them was always settled by the little old man who lived outside the town in the little house on the hill. And it was a very, very close, happy community. After a number of years, there arrived in the town what the Americans call a counselor. We in this country would call him a lawyer or a solicitor. And he set up in practice. He thought it was the right kind of town for him. He'd got his law degrees, and he would practice in that town. But he didn't get any business. Because it seemed, when there was any need for litigation, any kind of legal threats to be carried out, it was always done through the little man who lived outside the town in the little house on the hill. And after a few years, he was desperate because he had come to see that the people trusted that man on the hill. So the councillor one day gathered a few of his cronies round him and said, that man on the hill, he said, he's killing my business. I'm going to settle his hash. And they said, how are you going to do that? He said, it's very simple. He said, next Saturday morning, I shall go out to his house, and I shall take with me, cupped in my hands, a bird. You can come too. The people in the town will know that something is up, and I shall go up to his door, and I shall have that bird in my hand, and he will know it's a bird because I will leave the tail feather sticking out. I'll kick the door, and he'll come to the door, and he'll say, what is it, my son? And I shall say to him, old man, tell me, what have I got in my hand? And he will say, it is a bird, my son. And I shall say, right, old man, right. Now tell me, is it alive or is it dead? And if he says alive, I shall tighten my hands and show him the dead bird. He will be wrong. And if he says dead, I shall release my hands and let the bird fly away, and he will be wrong. So those people in the town who followed us out will now see that he is not so clever, he is not so wise. The Saturday morning came. The councillor set out with the bird in his hand with the tail feather sticking out, and his cronies, and bit by bit the citizens in that little town peeled off and joined them. And this little procession moved out to the old man's house on the hill. The councillor got to the door, and he kicked the door, and the old man came to the door. And he said, what is it, my son? The councillor said, old man, tell me, what have I got in my hand? And the old man looked down and said, it is a bird, my son, a bird. And the councillor said, right, old man, right. Now tell me, is it alive or is it dead? And the old man looked down at his cupped hands and looked back at the councillor and said, it is as you choose, my son, as you choose. That is what I think will happen to the next 50 years of Alcoholics Anonymous. It is as we choose. Now, I want to talk about the very simple message of Alcoholics Anonymous. I want to give it to you specifically because I don't hear it given too clearly around places I travel. The message initially of Alcoholics Anonymous to the new member is this: don't drink, get to meetings, and work the steps. Nothing about reading the steps or studying the steps, but work the steps. This is not a program for perfectionists. And the greatest people in recovery I have ever met will always tell you about their early days, their imperfections in working the steps, but they did work them to the best of their ability. I want to talk about one word in the steps. And it is, I believe, the most important word in the 12 steps. And you will find it exactly where it should be. It is the first word of the first step, and the word is we. This is a selfish program. Nobody has ever been able to show that to me in AA literature. This is a program where we stop being selfish. We drop the I and we become the we. We work together, not in isolation. I would like to point out a couple of other things that are becoming pretty apparent about the working of our steps for recovery. Now, I don't think I'm a purist, but I try to follow directions. Can we come to the third step? I'm not going to ask you, I'm not going to do a hall count or anything like that. All ask yourself a little question about the third step. How many of you have taken the third step as directed in the big book with another person? Because that's what the big book very clearly says. You take the third step with another person. That is how you take that commitment of that decision you have made. You become committed in the presence of another person. I'm just offering this to you because I believe if we are leaving this out now at this stage and glossing over it and not talking about it at our meetings and saying that this was how we did it, then we are watering down the message. The seventh step, humbly asked him to remove. Before I start on that, how many times do I hear people who've been around quite some time mention some defect of theirs, or have it mentioned to them and say, yes, I'm working on it, I'm working on it. Any defect we have as members of Alcoholics Anonymous who are working this program, we do not work on the defect. I have never been able to remove from myself my laziness, my anger, my chronic self-pity. I had to become willing to have God remove it for me. Or I can keep it down, keep it at bay for a little, but it will still be there. Alcoholics Anonymous says that is not enough. It's useless. That is a band-aid job. You actually become willing. You work at the willingness part to have God remove it from you. When you have found that willingness, this is the point I'm coming to. Step 7. You will see it 4 times in AA literature. Not once, but 4 times. You make the 7th step on your knees with another person. We have another person in the 3rd step, and that is our introduction to letting people work with us and we working with other people. We have it again in the 5th step, and we have it in the 7th step. Maybe, you don't think you want the program that I'm talking about. But I can only talk about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, which has worked for me till today. I want to talk about another subject that I don't think we understand too well. And that is about meetings. We are constantly told how important meetings are. Get to meetings. 90 meetings in 90 days. I don't think meetings are at all important. They've never been important in my recovery meetings. What has been important in my recovery is the group to which I belong who allow me to go to their meeting. Akron, they didn't have meetings. They had a small, tightly knit little group of people who knew everything about each other, who made the honesty part of their program become a reality with each other. Not this circulating round groups where sometimes you probably aren't even known. You're not totally exposed. The honesty part of our program comes down really to total exposure. And the right place to do that is in the group to which you belong. Not my group. That group will use me as they see fit. Now another, I'm not being too controversial, Emma. Sure, you won't see what's coming. Can we talk about that other little thing? Jack Howard of Leeds and Cambridge, he was a man. I saw him sponsor 2 people consistently over a period of years. I've seen many, many like him. And it was real sponsorship. First thing about sponsorship, in order to be a sponsor, you've got to have one. That is the first ground rule of sponsorship. The sponsor really has nothing to do except allow you to form a lifetime's relationship with him. A lifetime's relationship. I've had 3 sponsors in Alcoholics Anonymous. I want to tell you a little bit about it. My story is not unusual. It's pretty common, but except it doesn't appear to be so common in this country. The man who made the 12-step call on me, that perfect 12-step call 3 years before I stopped drinking, when I came back in, he was still there. I asked him to be my sponsor. He would. He was magnificent. For 3.5 years after I asked him to be my sponsor, he came to me one day. I was at a meeting and he walked in and stood at the back. Came up after the meeting and said, "Travers, can I see you outside?" And I was frightened, you know, the usual alcoholic reaction. Why? What have I done? What have I said? And he said, "It's all right, you haven't done or said anything. I've come across," because he lived not in Bristol, he came across to see me. He said, "I want you to get another sponsor." I was flabbergasted. But I said, "Why, Teddy?" He said, "I want you to get another sponsor." But I said, "Why?" He said, "All right, you haven't done it." He said, "You're entitled to know. I've been to the doctor today. I have terminal cancer and I shall be dead in 6 months." And he said, "I've come straight on from seeing the doctor now and I wanted to come and see you first." That was a He didn't go home and try to explain things to his family. He didn't go for a drive around in the car. He was straight back into the we of the first step I was talking about. And his thoughts were of me. Of course, I accepted it. Then came the problem. Who was my second sponsor to be? I suggested a couple of people. A couple of them Teddy didn't think was a good idea. And eventually he said to me, "All right, who have you seen in Alcoholics Anonymous whose recovery you admire the most?" Well, I said, "Sackville." He said, "Well, ask him." I said, "I can't ask Sackville. I don't know him well enough." He said, "You don't have to know your sponsor well enough. That's part of a sponsorship, is to get to know each other." I said, "But he lives a couple of 100 miles away in Dublin." He said, "Well, that's no different." He said, "You know, Bob was in Akron and Bill was in New York. relationships are not made because you're next door neighbors. And eventually I said, all right, I will write to you. He said, we will sit down and we will write 2 letters. I will write one to him, and you can write the one asking. The answer came back from Sackville. He said, yes, I will sponsor you on the understanding that you are fully aware that scores of people have asked me to sponsor them in the past who are now either dead or permanently locked up in insane asylums. Now, one of the great things I have to tell you about Sackville is I didn't like him. I admired him, I respected him, but I did not like him. And that was the beginning of the perfect love affair that I have ever known, most perfect love affair I've ever known in AA. It took us about 3 years to find anything other than the steps to talk about. And bit by bit, we found that although our backgrounds were so strangely different, we did have common interests. We built on those common interests. Right from the very word go, I used to go to Dublin to see him 4 times a year, and he used to come to me twice. I'll tell you something about Sackville very few people know. Probably one of the best known characters outside of America. Only twice in his recovery did he ever use the telephone. He was AA's greatest correspondent. We wrote, usually me 3 letters a week, him 4. And so this relationship developed until we traveled around the world together. We were in each other's homes, and we became very much in each other's lives. Now, what I want to say about sponsorship is this. Traveling around, as I have been fortunate enough to do, I see little pockets of AA where there is great enthusiasm and great AA. And I come back in a year's time, and I still see great enthusiasm, but different people. But where there is continuity with that enthusiasm, I always seem to find out that sponsorship is a very strong ethic. And therefore, I recommend sponsorship. I have overrun my time. I apologize for that. I have some other notes written down here. I want to talk first just a couple of minutes about the new member. There is a great cry always, and has been for years, about the new member as the most important person in the room. I do not believe that to be true. I never have. If you've been around in the last few years, we have plenty of new members. We don't seem to have so many old members. Many of them have dropped out for a variety of reasons. And when I've looked at those reasons, I have found that we who are still active with our groups have very often been responsible. There is an article, the lead article of Grapevine, which will tell you something about this for last March. We're going to have problems in the future, I can see, versus the drugs and the alcohol with our groups. That doesn't concern me or worry me too much, because if you read the stories in the first edition of the big book, you will find that those early 100 members all took drugs of some kind or another, and yet they were the founding fathers of our fellowship. We will live through that one. We're going to have difficulty related in what is being thrust more and more and more onto us from treatment programs, treatment therapies and things like that. And I want to say this, I think they are necessary. I believe they can be good. I hope they will be better in the future. But any form of treatment is only treatment. I think you go in to treatment, and what you get out of it is discovery. But it's in AA that you will get yourself recovery. There are 2 other areas I would just ask you to consider for the next 50 years that could cause us to founder. One is anonymity, and I will only repeat what Dr. Bob said. We must maintain our personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, films, and television at all times. Anything above that is breaking our anonymity. Anything below it is also breaking our anonymity. And the most difficult one of all, perhaps we will have to watch in the coming years, is money. We could founder on money. We have to have the money. And I have to say this, and this is nothing against what you're doing here in Manchester. The money we have to come to support the continuance of our fellowship must come from our own pockets. That is our own personal contribution. Otherwise, we will have problems with raffles, with dances, and they will not become raffles and dances. They will become money-raising functions. And AA does not do that. The only money that AA ever wants out of you is what you put in the bag or the pot. And when you put in the bag or the pot your contribution, that is not only your financial contribution to Alcoholics Anonymous, but it's your contribution to your own personal honesty of that day. I'm sorry I have overrun. I have great love for Alcoholics Anonymous. I have great love for you all. I have great love for Jim, and I only met him tonight. I've known Archie for years. And I have a very, very deep, fond affection for Morris, because Morris and I have been part of the we for quite some time. And I was able to share. Morris gave me, in some small respect, Idle John. And we all shared Jack. So that's how the we come into it. I'm just going to close with back to priorities. And I think priorities are something we always have to have before us, and I will give you my own personal example of that. Many years ago, I knew a lovely girl. She was in her early 30s, and I think this girl taught me more about priorities than anyone I have ever known. She had 3 young children and everything before her. And suddenly, out of the blue, she received a medical sentence of 6 months. She was going to die in 6 months' time. And she was the kind of person you could talk to about those things. And I went to her and I said, now that you know that you're going to die in 6 months' time, tell me, is there anything in your life you would have changed? And she said, yes, Travis. I would have changed 3 things. I would have played with my children more often. I would have loved more often. And I would have prayed more often. My love to you all.